right? So in a way, I go back to what George was saying. I mean, there's another consciousness that has to permeate our talk, and that consciousness has to be about us being humans. It has to be about being able to rise above all that divides me from you. If you ask me to put my affect forward on the table, then that's my affect. And there I'm speaking from the position, not from somebody, who in Erna's case or my case actually has the privilege of having a locality that they can rebuild. I'm actually thinking of people who are losing their localities, like those islanders who have to go somewhere else and they don't know where they have to go. So if the logic of climate change really accelerates, we'll have more such communities where people will have to go wherever people take them. And, initially we used to think of, when you are very deeply rooted in one place, you think of wherever is nowhere. That's why I said, I don't buy Hart and Negri's proposition that human beings should simply ask for rite of passage within their framework, because I think human beings just don't go anywhere. I go somewhere where I know people, English is spoken. If you told me tomorrow, there's a great job going in China, will I go? I mean, I don't know Chinese. I'll come to America. But some people, and maybe unfortunately in growing numbers, will not be left with that privilege of making that choice. So, of course, when we have the choice of actually having a locality and fighting for preserving that locality, I think Erna's point is totally right. That, in other words, the question is, what do I have to be in order to accommodate planetary thinking? And that answer will vary depending on my situation. But at the same time, all I was trying to say is that the planetary is very hard to think because we have not thought it. We think the global, and that's why we think categories like neoliberal, these things suffice. In other words, we put ourselves back into a history of imperialism, capitalism, categories we know, right? And to that history, the history of imperialism, capitalism, the larger history of the Homo sapien is irrelevant. I was simply asking, how do we make that relevant in our thoughts? Because it is becoming relevant, right? And therefore we need to know that, whiteness as a color of skin is very recent in human history. It's now dated, and it's only a few thousand years. Everybody looked black before that. So we need to know these things, and kind of, if these things become cognitive things, and if cognition goes with affect, our affects will change. They're bound to change. So, but at the same time, I was saying that the categories like species, Tim's question about culture. Now, one of the most interesting things is, of course, when you think about cultural questions, but you change the scale. So if you, for instance, I used to have these arguments with geneticists, friends, all the time. Because the geneticists would tell you, I can tell you the history of singing, the origin of singing in human history. And of course, they won't tell you a Rousseauvian story, right? They'll tell you some, genetic fabulation, about how in hunting humans may have needed to imitate voices of animals or whatever, and from that came modulation, whatever, and that was genetically programmed. And then I, as a social scientist, I will tell you, but that doesn't explain why somebody plays Beethoven and somebody plays Indian classical music, But the argument was once very sharp, and the division was once very sharp between evolutionary biologists like Edward Wilson and culturalists. In fact, when I first presented my paper in Canberra, and Barry Hindis of the Hindis and the Hurst fame, pre-capitalist economic formations, Marxist political philosopher, now not a Marxist, but still a political philosopher, and he wrote me an email saying, I felt like pulling out my gun when you mentioned Wilson. Because that was 60s debate, because they thought that the sociobiologists or evolutionary biologists were always reducing human beings to something else, right? But that's because we could afford to keep the scales separate. Now when I go and read sociobiologists, they don't always convince me completely. But at the same time, I don't think we can just dismiss them in the way that we used to, right? So yes, the culture concept goes through very different history, and my student Andrew Sartori, whose work you may know, wrote a very interesting article in Comparative Studies in Society and History on the culture concept and its history. And the anthropological culture concept as against the Arnoldian sort of high culture concept. But what I'm saying is that when you bring the scales together, then you need to think again afresh about these debates between, let's say, sociobiologists and us. So Jared Diamond, may have something to say to historians who work on much smaller sort of scales. And going back to your question about nature, now again the debate there is very interesting. I mean, one is of course Bill McKibben type argument, the end of nature, that there is no nature, human beings now create nature. Against that, the argument that our naturalness, the fact that we are part of the history of nature, is now being asserted by the very phenomenon of climate change. So again, like culture, it's a polysemic word. So many different issues are picked up in that question, right? But I go back to what Frank was saying. I mean, today's rethinking, that's what I'm going to say, that the rethinking of disciplines really were rethought with different results in the 80s and 90s. And for me, the interesting thing was that every discipline was questioning its central category, right? So historians like Hayden White, we were asking, do we have facts in history? Anthropologists were asking, is culture a valid concept? In Chicago, the economics department was saying, you can have economics without the idea of the market, right? Because they were actually working on a Pakistani city which was famously successful in exporting garments, but without having any recognizable marketplace institution. So they were actually saying, do we need the idea of the market to define the discipline? A lot of that was happening really in the context of globalization, anti-colonial discourse, decolonization. It seems to me that the context today is somewhat different for rethinking, and it's different to the degree that there's a new, very important crisis. But it's not different in the sense that all the other problems that people have been addressing of neoliberalism, colonial power, American arrogance, all of those things, they haven't gone away. And the reason why the locality will come back, all of this will come back, not just as a matter of personal ethics, is because the consequences of climate change will be mediated by the inequities of capitalism, right? So the inequities of capitalism will be drawn into the debate and will be part of the debate.
Okay, just to offer some very short, very brief reflection about some of the questions. To answer about the importance of affect, I better rush to tell you that I actually believe that that is one of the main topics, because I have organized an international conference that is taking place next week. As soon as I go back to St. Louis, titled Reading Emotions Towards a Transdisciplinary Understanding of Affect. So, having an anthropologist, Roger Bartra, as the main speaker, and most of the papers that have been offered for the conference have to do with the problem of violence and with the problem of fear and the questions of hate and how to elaborate antagonism, understanding that as the elaboration of conflict and not the denial of conflict. So there's going to be a lot of theoretical elaboration around that topic. But going back to the idea of the importance of nature and culture, I think that in order to start thinking about that connection in our contemporary context, we have the problems of Haiti. I was talking to a colleague last night about the problem of Haiti, and we have in the news the situation in Japan, nature coming onto culture and creating human annihilation, and the problems of policies of culture and regulation of science, what happened with radioactivity and things. So we have case studies in front of us that are going to make us think about calamity, about catastrophe, and about the role of culture and the role of nature, and the new convergences while climate is changing and threatening the balance of the planet. So I think that we have some case studies very concrete, and it would be extremely naive and very, very wrong to think that any of those case situations could be approached from just disciplinary, traditional disciplinary perspectives. So there you have the proof, the living and present proof that transdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary and extra-disciplinary thinking is needed in order to, we were thinking just about playing God in those situations, trying to be so creative in order to find a way out that none of the previous traditional ways of thinking will do. And if we get attached to those, traditional thinking, we're going to be trapped, and time is going to be playing against us. So I think that we have those very concrete. So if the planetary still seems a little theoretical, metaphysical, or difficult to conceptualize, we can still concentrate on some immediate elements in our context. And without losing track of that dimension, still try to understand situations like those in which every theory fails. It's impossible to apply any known theory to resolve the situation in Haiti or to approach the situation in Japan. And I think that we are going to have our hands full with that alone.
I wish us all hope. And I wish that we have the strength from somewhere, we get the strength of the spirit to deal with what we have to deal with, because it's here.
Couldn't end on a better note. Thank you all very much.
Yes, me too. I would like to thank for this wonderful occasion, this invitation, and this occasion to make so many new friends and meet old ones. So maybe you too. No, that's okay.